Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to listen. My name is Moises Gallegos. I am a clinical assistant professor with the Department of Emergency Medicine at Stanford. I also serve as the clerkship director. And so in those capacities, I get to work with medical students and residents, just like many of you do, both at the bedside and then with didactic teaching that we have to do. And so I'm excited today to be able to talk to you about a method of teaching that I personally enjoy, the chalk talk, or we were joking a little bit earlier, Bill and I, that it's not really chalk talk, it's the whiteboard talk, but the traditional name being chalk talk. It's something that I've employed for a few years now, having sort of enjoyed it as a chief resident and then doing it now as faculty. And I think the running joke with some of my colleagues is that you'll more likely find me with a set of dry erase markers in my hand or in my pocket than you will a set of trauma shears. And that's definitely true. My bags are all full of different colors of expo markers. So hopefully today, through this short presentation, I can impart to you, the EM educator, a little bit about my personal experience with chalk talks and how I see them fit into the teaching that we do in the ED, whether that's huddled around the computer, the doc box, or outside of a patient's room, maybe even at the bedside, and how I've come to see it as a way of starting a shift, perhaps ending a shift, regrouping in between patients, and even as just-in-time teaching or training. So with that in mind, I want to make sure we start on the same page. And so definition is always a good place to start. And so the chalk talk that I'll be referencing is the educational presentation where we use real-time illustration to emphasize learning points. And so it's not just sort of writing something up on a whiteboard in the department, but the act of in the moment teaching and using illustration. And by illustration, I don't mean just drawing or coming up with imagery. I mean the diagramming, the annotating, the engagement with the text that you're putting up on the whiteboard or on the sheet of paper. And so it's not just illustration in the form of drawing. In order to talk about any teaching method that we can use on shift, it's always important to talk about the barriers that we might have to structured teaching. And I put structured in quotes here because we do a lot of teaching, right? Emergency medicine, we do a lot of teaching at the bedside. We do a lot of teaching when you're handed a strange EKG, a strange looking EKG. But what I hope to address here is that sometimes we may not be able to signpost teaching for our learners, med students and residents. And so they may feel like there wasn't some structured teaching on shift. And that may be due to, of course, the lack of time, right? We sometimes can't start something dedicated, or we start and then we get interrupted by that recess coming in. But some people refer to barriers that they've experienced with this type of teaching, the chalk talk, as sort of a lack of preparation, feeling unfamiliar with the topic that the med student or the resident might want to hear about, or being really excited to teach about the topic, but not knowing where to begin. What should I include in this brief teaching moment? Of course, there's also sometimes the issue of dedicated space in the emergency department. Where could I do a chalk talk? And then the different levels of learners that you're going to be dealing with. How do I make sure that I'm not missing anybody or going too in-depth and confusing the learners instead? Now, for me, with some advanced preparation, I've come to recognize chalk talks as an opportunity to bring focused and structured teaching onto shifts. And so what I hope to impart is that through repetition, attempting to do chalk talks on shift can actually lead you to find a familiar tool. And eventually you'll do more on-the-go teaching, but it does start with some advanced preparation. Over time, as you give more of these pre-made talks, you'll just have them as a repository. You'll have them available when it comes up again on a new shift. But I do want to be clear that there's a difference between teaching on the fly, where you're making it up as you go, and having something prepared, but then utilizing it in the moment. And so what I think from the beginning helps with chalk talks is to have something already prepared in advance, not necessarily to a T, but just sort of having thought through it enough to be ready to present it. And so what makes a good chalk talk? What makes for a good chalk talk on shift? Well, the talk itself has to encompass a few things. It has to be brief, it has to be focused, and it has to be clear enough to understand so that if you happen to get interrupted, maybe because of that recess coming in or something else going on with the task switching in the ED, that you've hopefully have something condensed enough that if you have to walk away, it's not going to leave somebody with too much hanging in the balance and not understanding what's going on. So the talk itself has to be brief, focused, and clear, but the delivery has to also be appropriate, right? So it has to be an appropriate time. So for it to happen, it has to engage the learner, and it has to be a topic that hopefully is relevant to something going on with the patient care in the ED, so that it hits more, so that it lasts with their memory a little bit better. Now, for those of us in education, we always geek out on the learning theory, right? So hopefully this isn't too much of a surprise, but there's a lot of learning theory that can be applied to Chalk Talks. Micro-learning is probably one of the things that I relate to it most. So micro-learning came out of the concept of e-learning and the digital learning boom, but the idea being small learning units, both in sort of the content being small, but also the amount of time being spent, and creating a learning moment that is easy to digest. There's also the concepts of dual coding, processing information through simultaneous but different modalities, and therefore being able to facilitate knowledge retention a little bit better. And of course, when done right, I think the Chalk Talk can also embrace the concepts of retrieval practice and spaced repetition by incorporating activities with the Chalk Talk and forcing people to sort of tap into the knowledge they already know. And so to break these down a little bit, so micro-learning is, again, the goal being digestible teaching moments. So if we were to look at medical issues someplace such as COPD, CHF, and ACS, and we think about them each as like these sandwiches, these sort of standalone items, you could even take one of those and recognize that within one topic, you have several bites you could take. You could talk about nebulizer treatments and have that be one little talk. You could have a little discussion about steroid use in COPD. You could have a little discussion about antibiotics in COPD, and then non-invasive ventilation. So even within COPD, you have these subtopics that would likely focus you in a little bit better. Dual coding, again, this kind of helps me emphasize that it's not about being the best artist, but the Chalk Talk, the definition of Chalk Talk that we're using, the educational presentation using real-time illustration, that real-time illustration is helping you with that dual coding to get those learning points solidified. And so it's about using little arrows, lines, highlighting text in a certain way, like circling it or putting a square around it. But where it can get fun, as you can see my virtual background, you could even use that imagery in those drawings, things to just kind of like poke jest at what you're talking about, make sort of something salient to be remembered. So, you know, a joke like, let's talk about raccoon eyes, and you put a little raccoon up. So just to kind of make it a little bit more stand out for people to remember. And so with all that said, I think Chalk Talks in emergency medicine, they can be prepared ahead of time and delivered when appropriate. And you have them in your back pocket ready to go. And by preparing them, by having some thought process go into them, they can be done in stepwise fashion, again, allowing for those interruptions and that task switching to take place as well. You can, you know, looking again at that example of the sandwich, you can take a bite, put it down, come back later when you have some time, take another bite of that learning sandwich. And so what I will leave you with today is my 7 steps for creating Chalk Talks. So Moy's 7 steps for Chalk Talks. Step 1, no surprise. It's about selecting a topic, but where I think sometimes we lose ourselves is that we don't identify the depth of instruction that we want to tackle. By selecting the topic and deciding on the depth of instruction ahead of time, it helps us better define the purpose of the Chalk Talk and what information will be covered, but also what will purposefully be left out, right? And by sort of helping you focus in that way and framing what the talk will be, it'll help you prepare what you're going to say. And so again, these steps are the advanced preparation that you're going to do, but even in the moment of teaching it, you're going to go through some of this as well. So let's say you have a shift coming up, you might do this the night before, where you select a topic and then you decide how much of that topic you're going to review. And you know, the topics, how to actually select the topics, you know, people find that to be a little bit of a struggle sometimes. So some recommendations might be to look at your last shift and think about some stuff that you personally wanted to learn more about. What were some remaining questions at the end of shift? What topics have you been meaning to review for your own learning, right? As academics, we have to be very prepared for when residents have additional questions. And so what do you have to review this week? Or what's that new hot fancy topic that all the blog posts are talking about? You could use that as a way to start, select the topic. Step 2 would be to identify your take-home points, making sure that you, again, with a focus, recognize what you're going to be leaving your learners with. Because by defining the goals for your main points early in the preparation, you retain some of that refinement and focus that you meant to have by deciding how in-depth you were going to go. Step 3, this one's probably the one that's going to really set the tone for the type of chalk talk that you're going to give. And this is trying to visualize a final layout. Visualize what the image that you're going to leave your learners with is going to be. What's the diagram going to look like? So this addresses some of the questions that come up as well. Is, are you going to need a whiteboard, or could you use the back of an ECG to do this? Is it going to include a clinical vignette? Are you going to use text, drawings, tables, diagrams, and what will the flow look like? Are you just going to sort of draw from the top going down, or will there be different segments that you'll have to interconnect with some diagramming? I'll take a pause and address one of the questions that I get from colleagues a lot. Well, what if I can't draw, or if I have bad handwriting? Well, don't be dissuaded from doing a chalk talk, because it's not about being like Rembrandt or Monet. Picasso and Pollock work too. It's about the process of associating text with imagery and narrative, right? You're going to be talking, you're going to be engaging with the text that you've put up on the whiteboard, and that's what's going to contribute to the dual coding. And so if you're still worried, though, you can do some prep in the few minutes before you give your chalk talk. You could draw or write things up ahead of time so you don't feel pressured, and maybe it looks a little bit better. You could even tape or cover it up with some paper and then reveal it as you want it to come up. You could even use pre-drawn icons and images that you found online, just print it out and then put them up and annotate them as you go, right? So don't feel like because you don't have the best artistic talent or the steadiest of handwriting that you can't do this on a whiteboard. There are workarounds that can still help you create that engaging sort of real-time annotation of text. Having identified the topic, chosen the depth, some main points, and visualized what you're going to do, then the next point would be to, as you write your notes or as you prepare, to remind yourself of the salient points you're going to want to highlight along the way, and decide how you're going to do that with your text. Is it that you're going to write something up and then underline it? Is it that you're going to take that expo marker, the dry erase marker, and make thicker lines on a certain text that you wanted to get across and bold it? Are you going to use the different color ink that's available to you? Will you outline in some way, like circles? Are you going to put a square around something? All of these become visual cues to the learner who's watching you put this together in front of them, that they're going to need to remember that probably more than some other things. And so as you end up writing your chalk talk, you can highlight the points that you want to make along the way. You can also consider using a side margin for a list of learning pearls. So kind of just highlight it off to the side and say, these are the takeaways that you'll have to remember. And so learners know where to look on the whiteboard or on the sheet of paper at the end of it all. Step 5 is to plan for learner engagement, right? It's not just about you being up there and spewing some text and images onto a whiteboard, but it's about getting them involved. And so you could even purposely leave some questions that they'll have to fill out on the whiteboard once you walk away and are done. You could crowdsource part of the lecture, right? Surprise your senior resident by handing over the dry erase marker and asking them to fill out this next little bit. Perhaps using the COPD example, have them write out what Gold's criteria we consider. And then the assignment of tasks. So, okay, maybe a question came up during the chalk talk that you weren't ready for. You can always have that med student or the intern go and find the answer for you and come back at the end of the talk. So you've sort of given them a task to come back with later. The storyboard, again, storyboarding the night before or the time before you're going to give the session, creating an outline, and if possible, actually illustrate it out so that you have a drawing or diagram that will help you in the moment. So here's a simplified way of you to create a reference that then you can use as a guide for your talk, but then you may even share it with trainees after. Here's what I mean. Right, so if you were to just take all of the steps that I'm giving you, and the night before in a notebook or on a piece of paper, you kind of draw out the things that you're going to draw on the whiteboard, and you have a mini version of it. Over time, it might turn into something a little bit more colorful, right? Every time you give it, it's an iterative process. You might come up with a storyboard that's a little bit nicer. In this case, I'm just using the points I'm talking about today to demonstrate how my board might look like. This is my storyboard in the end, and then I use this as a reference. But then over time, it could turn into an infographic that then at the end of your 5-minute chalk talk, you end up emailing or texting to students. So this talk in particular about thyrotoxicosis, I've been giving it for a few years now. And so over time, I've created something that looks like an infographic to be shared. And then the final step, again, because we're academics, you want to make sure you have some pointed and selected reading that they can turn to when they want to do their more in-depth review, right? And this could just be sort of like at the end of the chalk talk down at the bottom corner, putting a couple citations for them to look for, a couple papers. You could bring in some creative connections, right? Post-it pearls made popular by Michelle Lynn at Allium. You finish your chalk talk, it's all up on the whiteboard, and then you can hand people some Post-its and have them, add to it what they would do. You could use a shared Google Doc where on shift you're adding notes along the way. Share on social media, right? Create a hashtag for yourself and for your program. Here at Stanford, we started to use EM on the farm, and then that way, when you post the pictures to Twitter, you can always Google it and find it easier and more easily later. And then crowdsourcing the topics, getting back at the issue of not knowing what you might want to talk about. I once just took a patient urinal, a new one, clean one, and just put a bunch of like scrap pieces of paper next to it and asked people to just write whatever topics they might want to hear about later. So it became the learning urinal. And I would just draw cards later and come up with these talks. Ultimately, have fun. There's no one perfect way. You'll find a comfort. Allow your personal touches to come through. If you love haikus, people can learn through haikus. If you're like me, you might want to buy a pack of dry erase markers and get as many colors as you can get. And always snap pictures, right? It may not have turned out perfect, but if you snap a picture, you can sort of adjust it for the next time you're going to be able to give this talk. And in the end, the goal is to make learning accessible for your trainees. You may not have all the answers, but you'll demonstrate some commitment to their learning by having put a little bit of effort into a chalk talk. And it may just spark their ongoing desire to go and do a deep dive into the topic. But remember that all of these teaching moments will add up, and people will see them as signposted teaching moments. When you took that sheet of paper and outlined something, when you gathered around a whiteboard, whatever it may have been, they'll see it as like, hey, they took the time to teach. So in the end, what your whiteboard or your sheet might look like is you have the title up top, main content in the middle, final take-home points with a few highlighted pearls off to the side, and also some questions or tasks that you might assign your learners. Make sure you select the topic, but also a depth of instruction. Identify those take-home points, how you're going to visualize it all, how you're going to highlight it for the learners. Plan for engaging them, and then if you can, create a storyboard that then you can share as a reference for them later, and definitely make sure to provide some selected reading. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. If there's any questions, I'm happy to address them.
So what is your answer to dealing with lack of space within a department?
Yeah, so this is why I joked a little bit about the EKG sheet of paper, right, and using the back of it. But sometimes, it's all about getting creative. And so, as I mentioned, using the Google shared document, you might have that storyboard that you created or the outline ahead of time, you can post it on a Google link and then have that texted out or emailed out. And so people might be able to follow along on their phones, which everyone's going to have on them, right? And so then they can sort of track with you as you're talking. That's one way to do it. And I know, previously I talked to a few colleagues about you can get creative with the use of sort of mobile projectors in the ED if you have sort of a learning kit or a learning toolkit, and you can hook up your phone and iPad that way. So you don't have to wait for something to open up or a space. You can just sort of find your own space as it becomes available. I also have a mobile whiteboard myself, so I'll block the sort of, let me remove my my digital background, but I have a notebook that functions as a whiteboard. And so on those days where I can't access any writing tools, I can actually bring a mobile whiteboard with me. And so this is just sort of, we'll take the dry erase marker, you can erase it. It also has like clear layers, and so you can sort of overlay. And so I've gotten a couple of these over the years. And so yeah, you can use these when you don't have that true whiteboard space, right? But just sort of to create some diagrams. Just wipe them down, take a picture when you're done, wipe them down, and then it's ready to go for the next time. It says, how do you change your approach when working with more advanced learners? So this might be where I kind of crowdsource a little bit, right? So I'll actually start the talk, and I'll start to mention where we're going and frame it. But then I'll hand over the marker and say, here, answer this question for me, but answer it in a way that put it up there. And so you're kind of challenging them, not just knowledge-wise, but also as an educator themselves, to try and condense the answer down to a learning pearl. And so it sort of makes them have to pull from their previous knowledge, but also think about how they can translate that. Any thoughts on using an iPad and Apple Pencil? Could screenshot them and then push to Twitter. So that's absolutely what I do. So when I showed the sort of infographic for the thyroid talk that I do, that's exactly what I've used, the Apple iPad Pencil. And what I've started to do more recently is use a mobile projector, right? The small little projectors that you can put in your pocket. And so you hook it up by Bluetooth to your iPad. You're projecting it onto the wall, and as you're doing it, then you just screenshot and you're done. And then you can share that via text and email. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the rest of the conference.